The following podcast contains subject matter that may be unsuitable for more sensible viewers. Views expressed here do not reflect that of any community that you would want to be a part of. Listener discretion is mandatory. Mama, what does trans mean?
No! But yeah.
Wait, so what was this about Space Jam?
Just the humor in Space Jam holds up a lot better than you would think it would, and it has actually superb pacing for a comedy. It's a lot better than you remember it.
For me, Space Jam is one of these movies, sort of like Rocky Horror, that I watched, and aesthetically, it's stuck in my mind very strongly. But as a movie, as a film and as a story, almost none of it was retained.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I remember the feeling of Space Jam or Rocky Horror, and I remember the aesthetic, and I remember being very drawn to it. But then the actual plot details kind of just flow through me.
Well, get ready, because pretty soon we're gonna have another generation that's not gonna know about Shrek. None of those references are gonna fly to kids in the Zoomers.
I barely remember Shrek. I'm sort of a Zoomer.
So on this episode, we're doing Shrek. Welcome to Tranifesto, the #1 Shrek podcast.
Yeah, we're gonna do a massive pivot and just talk about Shrek every single episode.
It's just a year's worth of Shrek,
and we have to watch it every time.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't watch it once and talk about it over and over. We watch it every single time.
On this week of Tranifesto, we watched Shrek on PCP. Our observations may surprise you.
Watch Shrek on different drugs and report with your experience.
Someplace,
ketamine episode.
Another podcast is born. Welcome back to this week's episode of Tranifesto on this very spooky
Halloween
episode.
Special Halloween double feature.
On the day of October 31st. That's right, folks. It's Pride 2, Electric Spookaloo. I am one of your ghoulish hosts, Madeline Hobbs. I'm joined today by...
Amy. I'm Amy.
No, you have to have a spooky... No, you have to have a spooky name.
What? Amy with, those goth emojis that you put in your Twitter URL? Like a bat and, a sparkle and, a coffin? You're
just the person who walks around.
I don't know how to pronounce those.
And just says you're a wine mom. And then we have one more person. Where are they?
And I'm the zombie.
Oh, there we go. That's the content I sign up for.
Awful.
I hate
Halloween. Halloween is not my scene.
Wow, that's sacrilegious. Anyways, yeah. So today on the Halloween episode of Tranifesto, the show that made us decide to start doing this fucking podcast along with the Danish girl, and the show that probably has I would say probably one of the largest pedigrees of any film we've reviewed or any series, and that is the cult classic
Shrek 2.
Yeah, Shrek 2.
Wait, I watched Shrek. Are we supposed to watch Shrek 2? Fuck. Can we take a pause?
The 1975 musical comedy horror film, The Rocky Horror Picture Show. Yes, that's right, folks. It's time to do the time warp again.
I feel like we started this podcast a year ago.
Yeah,
and
we're getting
doing
close
Rocky
to.
Horror was... I feel like it was a year ago. And doing Rocky Horror was a big part of the plan.
I believe what we said was that we would start with shittier films and work our way up to Rocky Horror.
Which means that less important films and try to figure out what we're doing and get better at this. I don't know that we have, but we are now stumbling into Rocky Horror anyway.
We're just as intoxicated as we were the first time. And we wanted to build up our own audience before we lost some of them to what I'm sure to be is going to be an interesting episode.
Factionalism.
Yeah, exactly. This is why the left has no unity. Because of this movie. And speaking of this movie, I'd like to turn it over to Amelia, who's going to give us a drunken summary.
Yes, I will do my best. So, Rocky Horror Picture Show revolves around these two characters named Brad and Janet.
Damn it.
Who are kind of the cishet stand-in characters who are stereotypical,
they're like mannequins you'd find in the Gap.
Yeah, exactly. Stereotypical white cishet couple who are getting engaged or got engaged because they felt like they were supposed to, and they're gonna go and get married together. And they do this at a wedding, and then after the wedding, where they
Which
got
is
engaged,
such a faux pas. Never do that.
Never embarrassing.
Never
shameful.
get engaged at a wedding. That's just terrible.
Oh god, that reminds me of the recent Revolutions episode about how Nicholas and Alex Romanov like got engaged at a wedding and like totally stole everyone's attention to them. This is irrelevant. So,
tune in for the history.
You're breaking the first rule. Don't like talk about better podcasts on your podcast.
Then we can't talk about any podcasts.
When they're leaving the wedding where they got engaged, they take a wrong turn and hit a dead end, and their car gets a flat, and they decide to go to this mansion that they drove past to use the phone. Mansion, castle, kind of like this, gothic horror thing. You can imagine it. It's raining.
It's Scottish
also,
B&B.
isn't it in like fucking like West Texas or whatever, or is there another Denton?
Isn't it in Denton?
Okay, so yeah, Denton, known for its gothic castles.
Yeah. So they get to this castle. This creepy sort of Igor-esque guy called Riff Raff invites them into the mansion.
Played by Richard O'Brien, the creator and director.
Yeah, we will get to O'Brien.
Yeah.
We will discuss him as a character.
Yeah.
As the English once said, we'll get to the Irish.
Riff Raff invites them in. They are shepherded into this big queer musical party. By the way, it's a musical. I don't know if we mentioned that. So it's this big, sort of flamboyant queer party. They performatively try to leave, but Brad still wants to use the phone. Then this guy shows up named Dr. Frankenfurter.
Yes.
Played by
the legendary Tim Curry.
Our king.
Absolutely king. And can we all agree that the true star of this movie was Tim Curry's legs?
Oh, God, yes.
I wish I had legs that good.
So Tim Curry sings a song, Sweet Transvestite from Transsexual Transylvania.
Iconic.
Very important moments. And then he shepherds them and everyone else into his lab, where he unveils...
To see what's on the slab.
To see what's on the slab. He unveils his creation, who is... Basically, Frankenfurter was trying to create scientifically the perfect top, because there were no tops in this queer mansion.
This was a time before protein powder was readily available. That really fixed the problem for a lot of people.
And so he did some Frankenstein shit to create the perfect top, named Rocky Horror. And so Rocky Horror is this like dumb, sort of brain dead model guy who is like Frankenstein's monster-y. But then Frankenfurter's ex-lover Eddie comes and does a cool song and gets everyone excited, including Rocky.
Played by Meatloaf.
Played by Meatloaf, yes.
Yeah.
King.
We stand a meat king.
But Frankenfurter gets jealous because Rocky gets excited, so he murders him with an axe and says that he had a naive charm but no muscle.
It was an ice pick, actually.
Oh, yes, good.
Let she who is out without sin cast the first stone. We've all been there.
It was a mercy killing because he had a naive charm but no muscle, i.e. he was a switch who pretended to be a top.
Many great people have killed their ex-lovers with an ice pick. Frankenfurter, Stalin.
So after
Fred Rogers.
After murdering Eddie in front of everybody, everyone kind of goes to bed.
As you do.
Brad and Janet get separate rooms. Frankenfurter, in their separate rooms, sneaks in and pretends to be both Brad and Janet. So he sneaks into Janet's suite and pretends to be Brad.
Once again, played by the legendary Tim Curry.
We will discuss this. Yes. She realizes it's Frankenfurter actually in protest, but then suddenly she's actually into it and they like fool around. And then Frankenfurter does the same thing to Brad, pretending to be Janet, who also realizes it's Frankenfurter and is like, I thought it was the real thing. But then they like fool around anyway, because Brad is, I guess, secretly
They're both
gay.
horny people.
They're just
okay.
super horny people.
Yeah, super horny people.
Meanwhile, Riff Raff is like tormenting Rocky Horror and like releases him into the mansion. tormenting him with the candle. It wasn't clear to me why he did this, but...
Yeah, there's this, like, animosity between Riff Raff and Frankenfurter that's, like, kind of hard to follow.
I mean, that's kind of, like, queer friendships in general, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, all of this is a metaphor. All of this is a metaphor for, like, a big, nasty queer polycule.
Yes, exactly. And, like, you join the polycule, like Rocky, and you're, like, confused as to why everyone's mad at each other. And you just, like, fuck everybody.
Yeah, the Venn diagram of poly people and people who like this movie is practically like a circle.
There's, like, exes among exes, just kind of who, like, they aren't fucking anymore, but they're still living in the same house, even though they're not dating anymore, but they're still part of the same thing.
Oh, God, don't talk about this to me.
It's too real. It's too real.
Who's among us?
So...
You're having flashbacks right now, aren't you? You're just like traumatized by the thought of it.
Janet, after fooling around with Frankenfurter, finds Rocky being all traumatized and upset about being tormented by Riff Raff. Riff Raff, of course, played by the rapper.
He goes by Little Raff. Thank you very much.
She is a virgin, apparently, and also insanely horny, and so she fucks Rocky. Because she's just fucking everybody.
To be fair, like, virgins are, like, the horniest people on the planet.
Yeah, the whole movie is, like, it is just Susan Sarandon getting more and more horny.
Oh, yeah, and absolutely, we do stand with Susan Sarandon. Absolutely,
oh, 100%. Queen.
This guy, like, Everett Scott, who is this, I guess, FBI UFO investigator, shows up at the castle.
Once again, as you do.
Who is also Eddie's uncle, and also
what a guy.
Brad's former high school science teacher. Because, you know, everyone knows each other in these circles. It's, you know, it's how it is.
Once again, maybe this is just a pro-poly movie.
So it's awkward because Frankenfurter is mad that the cops showed up to crash his party. But they all go to dinner. It's a super awkward dinner. They do a musical number. And like mourn Eddie, but then Frankenfurter reveals that they were actually eating Eddie's corpse. They kind of everyone freaks out. Janet like runs away. Everyone kind of runs around. They winds up in Frank's lab, where he turns them all into statues, and then Frankenfurter dresses them all up to do like a cabaret show musical number.
Yeah,
and turns them back into people, and they do a fun musical number, and then Riff Raff and Magenta, who I guess I didn't name. Magenta is one of the polycule members.
Also Columbia's there.
Columbia's there too. They stop the song to reveal that all of these, like the polycule, are actually like aliens from the planet Transsexual.
From the galaxy of Transylvania.
Yeah. And they will now return home, but Frankenfurter's like, oh no, I must go home. But they're like, no, you're not going home. We're going to kill you.
Yeah, because he failed the mission.
Yeah.
He had one fucking job, and that was to make the perfect top.
And he failed because Rocky is too emotional to top anybody.
And also, he doesn't smoke jewels.
Jewels are for bottoms. Top smoke cigarettes.
This episode brought to you by Jewel Pods for bottoms.
So
the jewel pod is what I name my ass. Anyways,
the alien usurpers murder Frankenfurter, and then Rocky freaks out and mourns Frankenfurter and like climbs up a tower like King Kong, but then they shoot him down, so they both die, and then everyone runs away, and the aliens return to Transsexual, and Brad and Janet leave, and that's like the end of the movie.
And it's perfect. Well, it's not the end of the movie in terms of its effect on society. So today's episode...
God, explaining the plot of that movie is so weird because it's definitely not like a coherent narrative.
No,
it is not.
And it's more about like the vibe than any actual plot points.
But like I was thinking about this. Like I really did not remember the plot of this movie at all, even though I've seen it like twice before this. Because when you see this movie, as we will get to, you don't watch, like, it's so depressing. It was so depressing sitting alone in my bedroom watching Rocky Horror Picture Show. Like, that is not the environment where anyone consumes this media.
Yeah, because I watched it with friend of the show Devlin, who had never seen it before. So, which was that was
what
a
did
fun
they
experience.
Say?
It was they had no idea what to expect, and that wasn't it. And the obviously problematic parts were problematic, but otherwise it was fun and good and good, mostly.
All right. Yeah, perfect. So just to kind of go over today's episode, because it's going to be a little different because of the magnitude of this movie, we're going to break it down into two sections. The first part, we are going to discuss the movie as it is, but then we would also like to spend a good portion of the episode going over the culture that came after it, the post-Rocky world.
Yes, you can kind of, like 9/11, you can kind of divide history into pre-Rocky Horror and post-Rocky Horror.
Yeah, you can split it into one of two towers.
Yeah, exactly. And just like 9/11, it's because people were incredibly horny. Sorry, I get horny for the Twin Towers. They're just so erect. Yeah.
So let's talk about the movie, the text, which is definitely not the primary part of this movie's impact, I feel. But it is worth discussing.
Yeah, and so the first person that we should probably discuss that everyone is probably expecting us to discuss, so let's just get this out of the way real quick, Frankenfurter. The character.
Frankenfurter.
Yeah, Doctor. Sorry,
Frank
I have to respect their time at fake medical school.
Furter.
So that character has probably, he is the iconic character of this movie. Whenever one thinks of Rocky Horror, you think of this character in particular.
Whenever, 30% of people think of trans women, they think of Frankenfurter.
Well, which is kind of what we should get into.
Yeah. So this is, there is a... Okay, so there's going to hear a couple different opinions today. Mine is that based on everything that I've seen, Frankenfurter was never supposed to be taken as a trans woman. Mm-hmm. According to the official Rocky Horror Wiki, and basically a couple places off Wikipedia, Rocky is a cross-dresser, not necessarily a trans woman. And so the issue that arises with people going, well, that's a trans woman, and I'm sorry, but Fox did not do themselves any favors by having Laverne Cox do it a couple years ago.
Yeah.
But really, I think that was a terrible move, but that's neither here nor there. We're talking about... Yeah, it's a moment.
Can we do that one as its own separate episode?
Yes, we will.
Yeah,
and also,
maybe.
Fucking Kylie Jenner or whatever the fuck. But I think the issue here is a really good example of highlighting the faults of a public seeing this and seeing what they want to see, because the character itself was written in a way that was cross-dresser. I never really saw them I don't know. I watched this movie for a long time. I'm 32 years old, so I've seen it for a long time, and I never thought as Frankenfurter as a transgender character. I never saw it when it was finally pointed out to me that they were. Mm-hmm. My response was, I guess. If you want to see that, I absolutely see how you could. Yeah. But for the most part, I just saw them as a cross-dresser or more of a symbol of sexual liberation from a frustrated male perspective.
Yeah.
Well, it's in the same way that, because the only people who think, because in the original text isn't trans, nothing about it indicates as being related to transgender, and even the
transsexual thing.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think that is just kind of
throwaway.
Yeah, and the author, who we can get into a little bit more later, kind of self-identified as transgender a little bit, but also had kind of a complicated definition of that. But it's sort of in the same way that people say trans. Oh, that's kind of like drag queens, right? Where it's if you have a limited perspective, you just kind of, your idea fills the largest available empty vessel in your head, and so you just kind of conflate the two things.
Yeah.
So
so what I would say about that is also that this is the 70s, and I feel like it's giving both the movie too much credit and too little credit to just be well, Frankenfurter was just a transvestite, the archetypal transvestite crossdresser.
Well, exactly.
Because in that historical moment, I think that there was less of a clear distinction in a lot of people's minds,
absolutely.
Including people's minds within the community. There, cross-dressing and drag were not necessarily these distinct, discrete, separate
They weren't as separate as they are now.
A lot of people that they are now. They certainly were separate, and I'm not trying to say that there were no true trans women in the 1970s, but I would say that this sort of gender fluidity and playfulness with gender and cross-dressing, it had different implications then, and there was less of a clear distinction.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have to keep in mind, too, the time frame in which the film came out, much like you said. The film came out the decade after the 60s. We went from having, free love on LSD to still free love, but on cocaine. So, of course, the sexual exploration is a bit more fucky. The characters themselves, I think a lot of people, it was the prototype one, if you will, of sexual exploration. The film itself, too, is supposed, by the director or by the writer's own admission, is a love letter to classic, or it's a queer love letter to classic horror. And I think by putting Frankenfurter in there, I think it's as ironic as it is that the writer played Riff Raff, I think Frankenfurter was almost like the example of what could be, or like the hyper version of it, or even possibly the writer exploring that within himself. Because the other thing too is like, and the part that I found refreshing is like, other than Brad and Janet, who kind of gave side eye initially to Dr. Frankenfurter at the beginning, none of the characters really seem to have problem with Frankie dressing the way that he does, which also is, I think, is a positive.
And one thing I wanted to pause and kind of go back to was like this idea of, you know, how at the time, like the way that we are using a modern lens to view it. One thing to look at is the song that's kind of like the climax of the whole thing is the Rose Tint My World song, which Frankenfurter kind of specifically like explains his like journey to his identity, like, which is, I just pulled up the lyrics, like, whatever happened to Fay Wray, who was like the lead actress in King Kong, which kind of makes the King Kong reference make more sense. But yeah, that delicate satin draped frame that clung to her thigh, I started to cry, I wanted to be dressed just the same, which is like a very like, that could take you to just being a, like, you know, extravagant cross-dresser, but also like a lot of trans people are going to see some view in that saying, oh shit, that's what I want to do. Like,
well, exactly, you could say the same words and people can draw interpretations from it. I mean, film is just an artistic medium, and it's just like a painting. Two people can look at the same painting and take wildly different things outside of it because we are projecting part of ourselves onto there. And not to put too fine a point on it, but there are those in the trans community that have an uncomfortable relationship with those who cross-dress because of the lack of education on the side of the public, that the two groups often get lumped into one another. And I think that's the same problem that we see here. Like Frankenfurter is a prime example of that.
Yeah, because Frankenfurter is like this fault line, I think, where that tension between like cross-dresser and like transgender does like make a lot of people have weird relationships or interpretations to this character.
But so I'm looking at the lyrics again, and just to think about, in the same way that, you know, like other versions of being trans and being gender nonconforming are projected onto Frankenfurter, I think that also kind of the idea that transition is like a fetish and and inherently sexualized is also sort of projected, because just kind of going back to what we said, I'm looking at the lyrics like that is followed up by, you know, give yourself over to absolute pleasure. This is basically about how autogynephilia is good, actually, which is obviously like kind of polarizing because that's something that people project negatively. But the idea is that this is somebody who, you know, embraced femininity and androgyny and took it to a like sexual place and is thriving on and hypersexual place, but is like thriving on it and is like wants to share that with other people and wanted to create a environment where like everybody can just enjoy hypersexualized like gender, like cross-gender stuff.
And that's why I was saying, like, I view this more like in the character of Dr. Frankenfurter as more of a sexual liberation icon rather than a queer icon.
And
like
sexual liberation is a big theme.
Yeah, because like, I mean, the film, yes, it has been embraced by the queer community as
and plus
one of ours.
Because sexual liberation is part of like the queer
embraced
journey.
and pushed away.
Yeah, but it's and like sexual liberation and queer journey have some overlap. But I think that was, at least from what I see and what I take away, like that was the main purpose of it. And like Rhys said, there's a queerness, there's an overlap with it. So those two just happened, no matter how you slice it, those two would have to, because I guess through the lens of the 1970s, like degeneracy was degeneracy. So for someone enjoying sexual pleasure to such a heightened degree was just the same as like, I don't know, two dudes going at it.
Degeneracy is decadence.
Exactly.
And decadence is degenerate. And so to be like queerness is decadent and
exactly. So and the way that the film is structured too, like it's an absurdist world. Like I mean, there's what like so what we start off
seems pretty normal.
Yeah, plausible. Yeah, I mean, like if Rhys going to quote lyrics, I'm going to quote some from one of the things where they said, "Touch it, touch it, touch it, touch me. I want to be dirty."
Yes, and that's like a big theme. It's like giving into your sexual impulses and fucking and being horny, and just
which again it's the 60s, but they found cocaine now.
I mean,
that's
yeah,
it.
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, they're like, yeah, the 70s are just basically that you had the like Hunter S. Thompson did a really good job of recording of like the burnout of the deadbeats of the 60s, like the hippies that were supposed to win and then they didn't, and like that demise up to the 1980s. And like this is basically
but now
what
we
this
have
is.
Coke, so we're gonna fuck a lot at least, even if there's like the Iraq War still, or not the Vietnam War.
1960s all, it's just like love yourself. It's like white guy dreads. It's perfect. And then like you have this come along, and it's just literally a touch of cocaine. Like everyone's more hyper and just over top.
Yeah, but also if you don't already have like a comfortable and complex relationship with your sexuality, then it's easy to take this and then spread it out over onto other things. Like if you're not a sexually liberated person going into this, it's easy for you to just throw your perception of this onto people that you see as like sexually degenerate.
Yeah.
As embodying this. So I feel like we can't talk about, just like I don't think we can talk about sex positivity as like a cultural force without talking about its more fraught aspects. I feel like we can't talk about this movie as a sexual liberation story without talking about its own dubious territory in that regard.
Yeah. So we'll get to, like, I guess this is still in relation to the to movies. So like I before, just kind of taking a pause from like the entry point and low bar ideas. There is a, with the 1970s. I mean, like Animal House was around that time. I think shortly after, and the whole fucking like Revenge of the Nerds shit, where it's just like rape as a joke. It's just, I'm sorry, like as much as I love this movie, even I'm willing to admit those scenes, as funny as I want them to be, are uncomfortable and gross.
No, it's really gross. I mean, consent in this movie just isn't a thing. Like they take off their clothes when they get there, like get into the mansion, and then obviously there's that scene where Frankenfurter deceives them both into fooling around with him, which like it's just like really like indefensibly
which sucks
gross.
Because I mean you could imagine that there's probably a better way to do it, because I like the conclusion where they're like actually, you know what, I'm actually not as stuck up as I thought I was, and actually I'm gonna like fool around with this weirdo. Like I like that conclusion, but like it's basically like, you know, like coercion to sex under false pretenses is not funny.
Yeah, which is like what, like I said, it's like a Revenge of the Nerds plot where it's just basically like, you know, some guy pretending to be some other guy sneaks into bed and sleeps with a girl, and everyone's like, good job, dude. Like I hate. Yeah. It's a trope, and it's a terrible trope, and it's a trope that has not dated well by anyone's standards.
I feel like it's not just a trope though. Like it's not just the Revenge of the Nerds thing. I feel like it's also an aspect of like the sex positive culture that was happening in the 60s and 70s, and a lot of people still cling to, where like to be not down is to be sex negative, and so consent becomes this thing that is both unnecessary and almost like indicative of some kind of sex negative attitude. Like if you're sex positive and if you're liberated, you're gonna want to fuck, and like it's good to force people to like do these things that they might not do otherwise without some pressure, because it's part of sexual liberation, dude. So like, you know, isn't it great that Frankenfurter got
it manifests in this way that like you kind of think of sexual liberation as being an incredibly like, in your head it's very feminine, but like this like represents like how at the time it was still very masculine dominated. This idea that like, you know, if you're not down with male initiated like sex under their own terms, you're sex negative. And it's like not even necessarily tied into the sort of feminist sex positivity that you want it to be in your head.
Yeah, no, there is like, I mean, consent culture wasn't really a big discussion until like the 2000s, which is, you know, it's a shame. But I guess it was just like, this is a very good reflection of the time where that was just not a thing that was on people's minds. It doesn't make it right. It's just that was not on people's minds at all.
It definitely wasn't part of the broad cultural conversation. And it's for me, it's really hard to dissociate the sort of sexual liberation themes of this movie from its issues with consent, because I feel like they kind of come from the same place.
Well, and I agree. And I mean, I don't know, sexual consent was one of those things that's taken about 50 years to have this weird maturation period, because like you had the 1960s, which was, like I said, the LSD free love movement, the hippies, that kind of stuff. And that was kind of the first go at it, because if you think in the 1950s, there wasn't really much in the way of sexual liberation. I think they were still giving women like hand jobs for fucking hysteria. But
What?
What, you don't remember this?
Reese, some women have penises.
What?
Natalie, can you just repeat that repeat your phrasing?
No, I stand by it. Look, so like the 1950s was not a great place for sexual liberation, and the 1960s was when the conversation started. It's a weird thing to square, and I'm not quite sure how I square it myself, because I'm not sure I haven't even an answer for it yet.
Yeah,
which is the idea that, like, this is where we started, and we started by saying, okay, since sexuality is so taboo, let's have everything. And then it was only 50 years later that we started getting caught up to the fact of like, well, what is the impact of this on people in terms of like a negative sense?
Yeah, and like sexual liberation was just a positive good and should always be encouraged. And this is like an expression of that, of like, look how fun and decadent we can be when we let our inhibitions go away.
It's a very like Roman Greek-esque of like just like fuck everyone at the fucking baths, as they did.
And no, it's not a critique of the movie per se. Like I mean it is, but I don't think that this is like, I'm not trying to say that this movie is canceled.
No, and I think that's a really good point to touch on. It's just like movies can have problematic things, and like I admit, as a fan of the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
What's that?
The Anita Sarkeesian line.
Zoe Quinn?
Yeah. What's that Anita Sarkeesian line that ContraPoints always quotes?
Do we have to quote her?
It's important to, even if you like something and enjoy something, to be critical about it, which she says in basically every single video, and people forget about.
Yeah, well, yeah. Fucking neckbeards.
Sorry.
And,
continue.
Yeah, that was a no-win scenario. But yeah, it's like that's exactly it. Like I enjoy this, and I also know there's parts that are problematic. I also know that this is like a fucking, for lack of a better term, it's like it's grease for sex freaks. Like it's just everyone gets in and kind of jumps on. There's caricatures, and that actually kind of leads me to another point we want to talk about, which is Brad and Janet as cishet inserts.
Yeah,
and their kind of journey through the film.
Also,
so, yeah,
I just want to pause quickly. Just one last note on what we were just talking about. The current queer community is not immune from that type of hypersexuality.
God, yes.
Consent as implied.
Yes.
Our Discord has a strict no horny policy.
I think I'm just saying, we have all, I think a lot of people who have been in the trans community for long enough have encountered other trans and queer people who take,
so we're gonna do this,
overt hypersexuality as given without doing the legwork.
Yeah.
Let me talk about this.
It's that we gonna do this? Okay. Predatory trans behavior. Let's
not
just
just trans
about
behavior. It's not even just in the queer community.
No, because it's like, this is a bad thing. This is pretty bad in the gay community as well.
Yeah, so those is predatory behavior.
It's also bad in like among leftists. Like it's sex positivity, and also increasingly sort of ethical non-monogamy.
A side shave isn't consent.
Become these pretexts for hypersexuality, which is fine. It's fine to be hypersexual, but it's not fine to encourage hypersexuality in others when they aren't necessarily comfortable with it. It's not fine to act like hypersexuality or polyamory or free love or sexual liberation is necessarily praxis, and so it is a positive good all the time. And that is an issue all over this community.
Where, just because you're super horny does not mean there's consent.
Where hypersexuality and fucking a lot and being really cavalier with sex becomes the expectation. And when we have a community full of vulnerable people, I mean the queer community, the trans community, but also like leftist communities full of vulnerable, marginalized people, that kind of attitude, that kind of expectation is really dangerous. It's really toxic because a lot of people feel pressured or pushed into sexual and relationship positions they really would not choose to be in.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this like there's parts in this movie, and the really uncomfortable parts kind of reflect that, which is
absolutely.
just the idea of like, you know, there's this weird romanticized version of sexual assault I find, which is just the no, okay, like I don't. It is something that it's like, again, it's a romanticized version of it that I have not enjoyed for as long back as I can remember. And I really do hate that is still somewhat of a trope that exists today. Not as much as it used to, I'll give it that, but it's still something that shows up, and it's very much in the community as well. It's like, just because you're queer does not mean you say yes. You could be hypersexual, that's great. That does not mean that other people are. Like, you know, I will fight violently for your right to masturbate.
And it can't be the expectation, because when it's the expectation, a lot of people who are vulnerable and marginalized and have a lot of trauma have trouble with boundaries and are easily pushed. And that's not their fault, but it's very easily exploited by predators. And so you wind up in these situations where, when it is expected, those people get taken advantage of.
Yeah.
And so when sexual liberation becomes like the norm and I struggle to find a word other than praxis, right? To kind of express what it is, which is, it's like the activist position. It's the right thing. It's the moral good. It's really dangerous and really toxic. And
agreed.
Sorry, there's my.
But also,
sermon.
like, but then to continue to kind of view this as a reflection of a queer community, we can talk about Brad and Janet as normies entering a queer community.
Yes.
Yeah, or even a sex positive one, but yes.
So Brad and Janet are these perfect stand-ins for how cis-het people interface with queerness. Like, it's beautiful. It is a beautiful depiction of this.
Yeah, it's I genuinely, this is kind of a tropey thing that shows up where in queer cinema, where they take they realize that most of their audience is going to be straight folk, so they like bring them along for the ride by literally inserting them into the film.
It's Brad and Janet. You're Brad and Janet.
Exactly. And so like you're watching through their eyes. So like at the time too, like even the reactions in terms of like disgust, or like the guy trying to keep it together while he's in his fucking underwear. Like all of those are like, it's weird. This is almost like queer horror queer humor in terms of like what we do in terms of making fun of cis-hets.
Yeah.
Or it's just, but like how it's like we have different terms for it, but I think that was like version 1. It's like the equivalent of putting on khakis and going like, oh, I'm going out to get milk today. Like I guess
about playing golf, watching sports, watching the game.
How are my stocks doing?
Is it going to be the brown shoes or the black shoes for today?
What racist sports team will I cheer for today? So yeah, it's I like the idea of Brad and Janet as along for the ride, because it's also like, it's just like, you know, thematically it works.
There's this fun dynamic between these two characters where they do this thing that a lot of cis-het people will do when they're interacting with queerness that they're kind of uncomfortable with, but also kind of intrigued by, where they do this performative repulsion or like disavowal while they really don't actually want to leave. Like Janet will be like, Brad, I think it's time to go, while Brad is like, no, let's stick around, it's fine. And then they'll like switch roles completely, where Brad is the one who wants to leave and Janet is the one who wants to stay. And they go back and forth and they both do this performative disavowal.
Hello? Oh, did we lose Amy?
No!
And that's when she realized the podcast was coming from inside the
Rain, what the hell are you doing?
I'm trying to fix your fucking podcast.
No, I told you. No, it's fine. Listen. Amy's mic gave out partway through recording. Her internet actually shit the bed. So to all of our fans and listeners, we apologize. This is going to be a two-parter. But we already sent this out over the Twitter, Rain. So I think people are going to be okay with this. You can probably comment down. Besides, I can fix this. It's totally fine.
Mom, you can't even fix a burnt-out light bulb. Anyways, folks, I'll see you next week. Johnny, hit that music.
No, you don't get to say that. I get to say that. This is the podcast that I help